October 25, 1944. The Philippine Sea churned beneath the hull of the USS KIDD as it cut through the early morning darkness. Lieutenant Commander Alan Roby stood rigid on the bridge, sweat beading beneath his cap despite the cool ocean breeze. His eyes narrowed at the horizon, where the first faint glow of dawn revealed silhouettes that shouldn't be there, massive Japanese battleships emerging from the Surigao Strait. Intelligence had failed them. These weren't the expected light cruisers, but capital ships with 14-inch guns that could obliterate his Fletcher-class destroyer with a single salvo. The radio crackled with orders. All American destroyers were to maintain defensive positions around the vulnerable transport ships carrying thousands of troops for the Leyte invasion. Retreat and regroup. Standard doctrine. Safe doctrine. But Roby's hand trembled slightly as he lowered his binoculars. The Japanese battleships would reach the vulnerable transports in 90 minutes at their current speed. By then, it would be too late. His crew of 320 men looked to him, waiting. Through the speaking tube came the voice of his executive officer. "Orders, sir?" Roby took a deep breath, feeling the weight of naval tradition, training, and direct orders press against his chest. Then he made the decision that would haunt and define him forever. "All ahead flank. Prepare torpedo tubes. We're charging them." No one in the 7th Fleet knew that one man's defiance that morning would rewrite the rules of destroyer warfare in the Pacific theater. Alan Mikaja Roby grew up far from any ocean, in the dust-blown town of Ardmore, Oklahoma, during the 1920s. The son of a railroad engineer and a school teacher, young Alan's fascination with naval warfare began with books borrowed from the town's modest library, tales of John Paul Jones and Admiral Nelson that filled his imagination with blue water and the clash of great ships. His father had hoped Alan would follow him into the railroad business, a stable career even during the Great Depression. But the boy who spent hours crafting miniature ships from scraps of wood had other ambitions. "The sea calls some men," his mother once told his disappointed father, "and I believe our Alan is one of them." In 1936, at the age of 18, Roby secured an appointment to the United States Naval Academy through the recommendation of a local congressman who had been impressed by the young man's academic record and determination. At Annapolis, Roby wasn't the standout midshipman his instructors might have predicted would one day make a fateful decision affecting thousands of lives. He graduated in the middle of his class, solid but unremarkable. His classmates remembered him as quietly competent, somewhat reserved, with an unexpected dry wit that emerged during late-night study sessions. One instructor, Lieutenant Commander Harrison, noted in Roby's final evaluation, "Shows unusual tactical creativity in simulation exercises, sometimes at the expense of doctrine. May require firm guidance from senior officers." That notation, buried in his service record, would prove prophetic. When war erupted across the Pacific in December 1941, Ensign Roby was serving as a junior officer aboard the cruiser USS Phoenix, one of the few ships to escape the devastation at Pearl Harbor unscathed. The shock of seeing the burning wreckage of the Pacific Fleet transformed Roby. Shipmates noted how the once reserved officer became intensely focused, spending his free hours studying Japanese naval tactics and unconventional warfare. By 1943, Roby had been promoted to lieutenant and transferred to the newly commissioned Fletcher-class destroyer USS KIDD, named after Rear Admiral Isaac Campbell Kidd, who had been killed at Pearl Harbor. The symmetry wasn't lost on Roby, serving on a ship named after an admiral who died in the same attack that had forged his own determination to defeat the Japanese Navy by any means necessary. The crew of the KIDD initially viewed their new executive officer with some skepticism. Destroyermen were a tight-knit brotherhood with their own traditions and superstitions. Roby's cerebral approach and by-the-book demeanor didn't immediately endear him to men who valued practical experience over Naval Academy theories. Chief Petty Officer Malcolm Reeves, a destroyer veteran since the 1930s, summed up the early sentiment. "We figured he was just another Annapolis ring-knocker." who'd get us all killed with fancy maneuvers instead of solid seamanship. But during their shakedown cruise and first combat operations, Roby earned their respect through unexpected means. During an air attack near the Solomon Islands, he abandoned the safety of the bridge to help damaged control parties fight a fire that threatened the ship's ammunition magazine. Later, during shore bombardment operations, he demonstrated an uncanny ability to interpret terrain maps and place destructive fire exactly where ground forces needed it. By early 1944, when Lieutenant Commander Ferguson was transferred and Roby received command of the KIDD, the crew had developed an unusual confidence in their young captain. As torpedoman's mate, First Class Daniel Elkins later wrote home, "Our skipper isn't the kind who shouts or makes speeches, but when he gives an order, there's something in his voice that makes you believe he's already seen 10 moves ahead on the chessboard." He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between life and annihilation. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 represented the Imperial Japanese Navy's desperate attempt to reverse the tide of the Pacific War. American forces under General Douglas MacArthur were returning to the Philippines, fulfilling his famous promise, "I shall return." The naval battle that developed around this invasion would become the largest naval engagement in modern history, and one of the most complex. The Japanese plan, designated Shogo, or Victory Operation, was intricate and daring. It divided their remaining naval strength into 3 separate forces. The northern force of aircraft carriers would serve as bait, drawing the powerful American Third Fleet, under Admiral William Bull Halsey, away from the landing areas. Meanwhile, 2 other Japanese forces, the Center Force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita and the Southern Force under Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, would approach through different straits and converge on the vulnerable American invasion transports. The plan nearly succeeded. On October 24th, Halsey took the bait, racing north with his powerful carrier groups and fast battleships to destroy the Japanese carrier force, leaving the San Bernardino Strait inadequately guarded. The Center Force, despite being badly mauled in preliminary engagements, pushed through during the night. The Southern Force, consisting of 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 4 destroyers, approached through the Surigao Strait toward the Leyte landing areas. Waiting for them was the U.S. 7th Fleet's Task Group, 77.2 under Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, 6 battleships, most of which had been raised and repaired after Pearl Harbor, 8 cruisers, and 28 destroyers arranged in a classic naval formation known as crossing the T. What should have been a textbook victory for the Americans was complicated by communication failures, conflicting intelligence, and the fog of war. Reports placed Japanese light cruisers approaching through secondary channels, not the battleships Yamashiro and Fuso that were actually bearing down on the American position. The transports carrying more than 100,000 American soldiers for the Leyte invasion were protected by a screen of destroyers, including the USS KIDD. These small warships were the first line of defense against any Japanese naval threat that might break through the main American battle line. Standing orders for destroyer screen commanders were explicit. Maintain defensive positions around the transports at all costs. Do not pursue enemy forces without direct orders. Do not engage capital ships without battleship or cruiser support. These orders reflected decades of naval doctrine. Destroyers were escort vessels and torpedo delivery platforms not meant to directly confront battleships with their massive guns and heavy armor. A Fletcher-class destroyer like the KIDD displaced 2,100 tons and carried 5 5-inch guns. The Japanese battleship Yamashiro displaced 32,000 tons and carried 12 14-inch guns. The disparity was like a coyote confronting a bull elephant. The night of October 24th into the 25th was moonless, with scattered clouds obscuring what little starlight might have illuminated the sea. The USS KIDD and 3 other destroyers of Destroyer Division 112 had been assigned to the eastern flank of the transport protection screen, closest to the secondary approach through the Surigao Strait. Radar technology in 1944 was still developing. The SG surface radar aboard the KIDD could detect large ships at ranges up to 10 miles, but identification remained challenging. False returns, weather interference, and equipment malfunctions were common. At 0300 hours, KIDD's radar operator, Petty Officer Second Class Howard Mattingly, reported contacts emerging from the strait. The initial assessment from Fleet Intelligence classified these as light cruisers, possibly a diversionary force or scouts for the main Japanese thrust expected elsewhere. Lieutenant Commander Roby studied the radar plot with growing concern. The movement patterns and spacing of the contacts didn't match Japanese cruiser tactics he had studied so intently. The ships were moving too deliberately, with a confidence that suggested superior firepower. "Those aren't cruisers," he muttered. To his executive officer, Lieutenant Parker, "The displacement is all wrong." Roby requested clarification from Task Group Command, but communication channels were overwhelmed with traffic from the main engagement developing in the strait. The response, when it finally came, was terse. "Maintain position, defensive posture only. Capital ships will engage." But the position of the American battleships and cruisers was 15 miles northwest, positioned to cross the T of the expected main Japanese force. If these ships emerging from the secondary channel were indeed capital ships, they would pass east of the American battle line, directly toward the transport area. Lieutenant Parker studied the plot and whispered, "Sir, if those are battleships, they'll reach the transports before our heavy units can reposition." Roby nodded grimly. "And if they're battleships, they'll outrange our torpedoes until it's too late." The Fletcher-class destroyer carried 10 21-inch torpedo tubes with a maximum effective range of 10,000 yards, 5 nautical miles. Japanese battleships could open fire with their main batteries at 20,000 yards or more. The mathematics of naval warfare were suddenly crystal clear to Roby. If he obeyed orders and waited, the Japanese ships would methodically destroy his destroyer from beyond torpedo range, then proceed to the transports where thousands of American soldiers would be slaughtered. At 0315 hours, radar contact was confirmed. The ships were now identified as 2 battleships with escorting vessels. Urgent messages flew between destroyer division commanders and task group headquarters. The American battle line began to shift position, but naval warfare in 1944 moved at the speed of ships, not radio waves. The battleships would need nearly an hour to reposition. The transports didn't have an hour. Roby ordered general quarters. Throughout the KDD, the alarm sounded and men raced to battle stations. In the torpedo rooms, crews removed the safety mechanisms from the Mark 15 torpedoes. Gun crews manned the 5-inch mounts and loaded the magazines with high-explosive shells, largely ineffective against battleship armor, but capable of damaging superstructures and secondary weapons. The atmosphere on the bridge was tense as officers awaited orders. Lieutenant Junior Grade Michael Collins, the navigation officer, cleared his throat. "Standard doctrine says we should lay smoke and withdraw, sir." Roby didn't respond immediately. He was calculating distances, speeds, and angles of approach. The Japanese battleships were now 12 miles out and closing at 20 knots. The American battle line was shifting but would not intercept in time. The choice crystallized with brutal clarity: follow doctrine and watch as thousands died, or attempt the impossible. At 0330 hours, the USS KIDD received explicit orders from Destroyer Division Command. All destroyers maintain screen around transports, defensive posture only. Acknowledge. Lieutenant Parker acknowledged the order, then looked to Roby for confirmation. The bridge fell silent. Every officer present knew what doctrine demanded. Roby stared at the radar plot for 10 more seconds, then raised his head. His voice was calm, but carried an intensity that silenced all conversation on the bridge. "Gentlemen, I believe those battleships intend to bombard our transports from beyond our torpedo range. There are 20,000 men on those transports. We cannot allow that to happen." He turned to the helmsman. "Come to course 090, all ahead flank." Lieutenant Parker stiffened. "Sir, our orders—" "I'm well aware of our orders, XO," Robbie cut him off, "and I'll bear full responsibility for disregarding them. But I will not wait here while those battleships slaughter our men." He picked up the announcing microphone. Throughout the ship, his voice echoed, "All hands, this is the captain. We are engaging enemy battleships. This is not a drill. Torpedo crews stand ready for surface action. Gun crews prepare for distraction fire. We're going to close the range and deliver torpedoes before they expect us. That is all." As the KIDD's engines built to flank speed and the destroyer heeled over in a sharp turn toward the enemy, Roby turned to his executive officer. "Signal the rest of the division. Tell them our intentions. They can follow or maintain position as their commanders decide." The die was cast. At 27 knots, the USS KIDD charged directly toward Japanese battleships with guns that could obliterate her with a single salvo. No destroyer captain in his right mind would consider such a tactic. That was precisely why Roby believed it might work. The USS KIDD sliced through the dark waters of the Philippine Sea at maximum speed, the bow throwing phosphorescent spray as it drove directly toward the Japanese battleships. In the Combat Information Center below decks, radar operators tracked the enemy formation with growing tension. The Japanese ships maintained their course and speed, apparently unaware of the lone destroyer racing toward them. On the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Roby gripped the edge of the plotting table, his knuckles white. The gamble rested on a single premise. Japanese doctrine, like American, assumed destroyers would never directly charge battleships. They would expect any destroyer attack to come from the flanks under cover of darkness or smoke, launching torpedoes from maximum range before retreating. A frontal assault was tactical suicide, according to every naval warfare textbook ever written. "Range to target?" Roby called. 10,800 yards and closing," replied the radar operator. "We'll be within torpedo range in 2 minutes." Lieutenant Parker had followed his commander's order despite his reservations. Now he stood beside Roby, tension evident in his tight jaw. "Sir, shouldn't we begin evasive maneuvers?" "Negative," Roby replied. "Straight approach. Any deviation from course might alert them that we're not just a patrol boat or scout." The minutes stretched into eternities. Every man aboard the KIDD understood the nature of their gambit. In the torpedo rooms, crews stood by their weapons, hands steady despite the knowledge that they were charging toward ships that could annihilate them with casual ease. In the engine room, machinists coaxed every possible revolution from the overheating turbines. At the gun mounts, crews waited in silence, knowing their weapons would serve only as distractions against the massive armor of a battleship. Chief Petty Officer Malcolm Reeves moved between gun stations, checking each crew. "Remember, boys," he told them quietly, "aim for the superstructure and fire control. We just need to give the torpedo boys their chance." Lieutenant Scott Hawkins, the torpedo officer, made final calculations in the plotting room. The optimal firing solution would require perfect timing and steady nerves. "All torpedo tubes report ready," he confirmed over the ship's circuit. At 5,000 yards, just under 3 miles, the Japanese finally reacted. A searchlight flared from one of the battleships, sweeping the water and catching the KIDD in its glare. Seconds later, the secondary batteries of both battleships opened fire. 5-inch and 6-inch shells began to splash around the destroyer. "Maintain course," Roby ordered, his voice unnaturally calm. "Gun crews, commence firing. Target the searchlights and bridge structures." The KIDD's 5-inch guns roared to life, sending shells screaming toward the Japanese vessels. The odds of causing serious damage were minimal, but each flash and explosion might momentarily blind Japanese gunners and disrupt their aim. At 4,000 yards, the situation intensified dramatically. The main batteries of the lead battleship, now identified as the Yamato, fired a salvo. 8 14-inch shells arced high into the night sky before plunging toward the KIDD. The massive projectiles, each weighing nearly 1,600 pounds, created towering waterspouts as they bracketed the destroyer. The KIDD shuddered as near misses sent tons of water crashing onto her decks. In the forward torpedo mount, torpedoman's mate first class. Daniel Elkins felt the ship lurch beneath him, but kept his eyes fixed on the firing panel. The Japanese gunners were finding their range. "Incoming!" shouted the lookout. Another salvo was on its way. Roby finally gave the order everyone had been waiting for. Begin evasive action. Hard left rudder. The helmsman spun the wheel and the KIDD heeled sharply. The sudden course change came just as Japanese fire control systems had established a solution. The 14-inch shells crashed into the water 50 yards to starboard, close enough for shrapnel to pepper the destroyer's side. 3,500 yards to target, called the radar operator. Speed 27 knots. All tubes stand by, Roby ordered. Firing point procedures. Lieutenant Hawkins confirmed from the torpedo director. Solutions set for both targets. Tubes 1 through 5 targeted on lead battleship, tubes 6 through 10 on trailing battleship. The critical moment approached. Fletcher-class destroyers carried 10 torpedo tubes in 2 quintuple mounts, 1 forward and 1 amidships. Each Mark 15 torpedo carried a warhead of 500 pounds of explosive, enough to cripple or sink even the largest warship if it struck in the right location. At 3,000 yards, the Japanese defense intensified. Machine gun fire joined the barrage, tracers streaking across the water toward the KIDD. The battleships began evasive maneuvers of their own, but their massive bulk made them far less nimble than the destroyer. "They're turning to bring their full broadsides to bear," Lieutenant Parker observed, his voice tense. Roby nodded. "That's what we want. Presents a larger target profile for our torpedoes." He raised the microphone again. "All hands, stand by for torpedo launch. After launch, we will execute immediate withdrawal at maximum speed." The range closed to 2,800 yards, point-blank range in naval combat terms. The KIDD was now well within effective torpedo range, but also deep within the killing zone of every weapon the Japanese battleships could bring to bear. "Fire torpedoes!" Roby commanded. Lieutenant Hawkins pressed the firing switches in rapid sequence. On the deck of the KIDD, the torpedo tubes swung to their final bearing, and with a series of compressed air hisses, 10 torpedoes leapt from their tubes and entered the water. Each torpedo ran straight and true toward its target, their wakes barely visible in the darkness. "All torpedoes away," reported Lieutenant Hawkins. "Running hot, straight, and normal. Hard right rudder," Roby ordered immediately. "All engines emergency flank. Make smoke." The KIDD heeled violently in the opposite direction, smoke generators belching thick chemical clouds to obscure their retreat. The sudden maneuver threw men against bulkheads and equipment, but every sailor held fast to his station. Japanese shells continued to fall around them, the accuracy improving with each salvo. A 5-inch shell struck the KIDD's aft deckhouse, exploding with a thunderous roar and sending shrapnel in all directions. 3 men from the aft gun crew went down, their screams audible even over the din of battle. The torpedo room crews counted down the seconds until impact. Mark 15 torpedoes traveled at approximately 35 knots, taking just over 2 minutes to cross the remaining distance to their targets. 1 minute after launch, a lookout shouted, "They've spotted the torpedo wakes. Both battleships are turning." The Japanese captains had finally recognized the mortal threat. Both battleships began emergency evasive maneuvers, their massive hulls struggling to change course quickly enough to avoid the incoming torpedoes. "Will they clear?" Lieutenant Parker asked tensely. Roby didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on his watch, counting down the seconds. At 1 minute and 40 seconds after launch, the night turned to day. A massive explosion erupted from the side of the Yamashiro as a torpedo struck just forward of amidships. Seconds later, 2 more explosions blossomed along her hull. The second battleship, Fuso, turned more sharply but couldn't escape completely. A single torpedo struck her stern, the explosion less dramatic but still significant. 3 hits on the lead battleship, 1 hit on the trailing ship, called the lookout, his voice cracking with excitement. The bridge crew of the KIDD erupted in cheers, but Roby silenced them with a raised hand. "Maintain evasive maneuvers. They're wounded, not dead." His caution proved warranted. Despite suffering multiple torpedo hits, the Yamashiro's guns continued to fire. A salvo of 14-inch shells screamed overhead, missing by mere yards. The concussion was enough to shatter windows on the bridge and send men sprawling. The KIDD continued its maximum speed retreat, zigzagging through the darkness as the Japanese battleships fell behind. The destroyer had suffered moderate damage from near misses and one direct hit, with 14 men wounded and 3 killed. But she remained combat effective. As they opened the range, radar showed additional contacts approaching rapidly from the northwest, American destroyers from other divisions responding to the KIDD's action despite standing orders. "Looks like we're not the only ones disobeying orders tonight," Lieutenant Parker remarked, a hint of grim satisfaction in his voice. The USS Ross, Walker, and Monaghan had broken formation to join the attack, launching additional torpedoes from different angles. Behind them came heavier units, cruisers redirected from the main battle line to engage the Japanese force that had nearly slipped through. At 04:15 hours, 45 minutes after the KIDD's initial torpedo launch, the Yamashiro capsized and sank, taking most of her crew of 1,900 men to the bottom. The Fuso, damaged but still operational, reversed course and attempted to escape through the strait, only to encounter the full weight of Admiral Oldendorf's battle line, now properly positioned to cross the T. She would not survive the dawn. As the first light of morning touched the eastern horizon, Lieutenant Commander Roby finally allowed himself to sit, exhaustion etching lines in his face. The KIDD limped back toward the transport area, her hull scarred but intact, her crew battered but triumphant. Chief Petty Officer Reeves approached the bridge, his uniform stained with smoke and blood from helping the wounded. "Captain," he said quietly, "the men were wondering, what happens now?" Roby met his gaze steadily. "Now, Chief? Now we face the music for disobeying direct orders." Private First Class Jensen froze. He couldn't believe what he'd just seen. From his position aboard the troop transport, USS President Polk, he had a clear view of the naval battle unfolding at the mouth of the Surigao Strait. He had watched in disbelief as a single American destroyer charged directly toward Japanese battleships, a David versus Goliath scenario that defied all military logic. "Did you see that?" he asked the soldier next to him, Corporal Williams. "That destroyer just went straight at them." "Straight at them." Williams nodded, his face pale in the pre-dawn light. "Never seen anything like it. They must be crazy or desperate." Neither man knew it yet, but they were witnessing an action that would save both their lives and the lives of thousands of other soldiers packed into vulnerable transports. The KIDD's charge had disrupted the Japanese battleship's approach, forcing them to engage destroyers, rather than proceeding unmolested to the transport area where their 14-inch guns would have wreaked havoc among the thin-skinned troopships. By the time the sun fully rose over Leyte Gulf on October 25, 1944, news of the KIDD's action had spread throughout the fleet. The official response from High Command was mixed. Tactically, the unauthorized attack had succeeded brilliantly, disrupting the Japanese approach and contributing to the destruction of their southern force. Strategically, it had helped protect the invasion force and potentially saved thousands of lives, but it had also blatantly violated standing orders and naval doctrine. Admiral Thomas C. Kinkaid, commander of the 7th Fleet, summoned Lieutenant Commander Roby to his flagship that afternoon. The meeting was brief and private. No transcript exists of their conversation, but officers waiting outside reported hearing raised voices. When Roby returned to the KIDD, his expression revealed nothing. He gathered his officers in the wardroom and spoke quietly. "Gentlemen, I have been officially reprimanded for exceeding orders and endangering this vessel without proper authorization." A murmur of protest rose from the assembled officers, but Roby silenced them with a gesture. "However," he continued, "Admiral Kinkaid also conveyed his unofficial appreciation for our initiative. There will be no formal charges. We are to resume normal duties immediately." Lieutenant Parker pressed for details. "So that's it? A slap on the wrist after what we accomplished?" Roby's lips tightened slightly. The official report will state that we were conducting a reconnaissance in force when we encountered the enemy vessels. Our subsequent attack will be recorded as an appropriate response to an imminent threat to the invasion force. The truth was more nuanced. Roby had indeed been severely reprimanded, but senior commanders recognized the impossible choice he had faced. More importantly, they recognized success. The destruction of the Japanese Southern Force had been complete. By dawn on October 25th, both battleships and most of their escorts lay at the bottom of the Surigao Strait. Not a single Japanese shell had reached the transport area. In the days that followed, as American forces consolidated their beachhead on Leyte, destroyer squadron commanders throughout the 7th Fleet received a classified directive. Destroyer groups were authorized to initiate independent action against capital ships under specific circumstances, provided torpedo attacks could be executed from advantageous positions. The directive never mentioned the USS KIDD by name, but every destroyer captain in the fleet understood its origin. Naval doctrine was evolving in real time, shaped by the actions of those willing to risk everything when circumstances demanded it. For the crew of the KIDD, the aftermath of their action brought a complex mix of pride, grief, and quiet recognition. The ship received a Navy unit commendation for extraordinary heroism in action against enemy Japanese forces, the citation carefully worded, to avoid mentioning the unauthorized nature of their attack. The 3 sailors killed in action: gunner's mate, 3rd Class Robert Thompson, seaman 1st Class Henry Doyle, and radarman 2nd Class James Wilson, were buried at sea with full honors. The 14 wounded recovered in field hospitals on Leyte, each man awarded the Purple Heart. When asked about his decision years later, Roby would deflect with characteristic modesty. "We did what any ship would have done in those circumstances. The men performed admirably, that's all. But those who served with him knew better." As torpedoman's mate Daniel Elkins wrote in his memoir after the war, "There wasn't another destroyer skipper in the fleet who would have charged those battleships head-on. Most of us thought it was suicide when he gave the order, but something in his voice made us believe it would work, and it did." The Battle of Surigao Strait would be recorded as the last battleship versus battleship engagement in naval history. The decisive American victory there, combined with actions in other sectors, secured the Leyte landing and accelerated the liberation of the Philippines. For Lieutenant Commander Alan Roby, the war continued. The USS KIDD participated in further operations in the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. During the latter campaign, the ship was struck by a kamikaze aircraft on April 11, 1945, suffering 38 men killed and 55 wounded. Roby was among the wounded, sustaining shrapnel injuries that would trouble him for the rest of his life. When the war ended in August 1945, Roby returned to a nation celebrating victory, but eager to move beyond the sacrifices that had secured it. Like many combat veterans, he found the transition to peacetime challenging. He remained in the Navy until 1952, reaching the rank of commander before retiring to a small town in Virginia. He married Eleanor Hayes, a Navy nurse he had met during his recovery from the kamikaze attack. They had 3 children and lived quietly, Roby rarely discussing his wartime experiences, even with family. He taught mathematics at a local high school, his students unaware that their soft-spoken teacher had once made a decision that saved thousands of lives. In 1963, nearly 2 decades after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Roby received an unexpected letter from a man named Thomas Jensen, the same Private Jensen who had watched the KIDD's charge from the transport ship. Jensen had spent years researching the battle and tracking down Roby. "I have 3 children and 5 grandchildren who would not exist had your destroyer not acted when it did," Jensen wrote. "The men on those transports knew what you did for us, even if the history books don't tell the full story. We never forgot." Jensen's letter was one of dozens that eventually reached Roby as aging veterans of the Leyte campaign began sharing their stories. A common thread emerged from these accounts. The sight of a single destroyer charging toward Japanese battleships had become a symbol of American determination and courage for the men awaiting battle on the transports. In the official histories of the Pacific War, the actions of the USS KIDD at Surigao Strait received only modest attention, a footnote to the larger battle. Naval historians focused on the textbook Crossing the T maneuver, executed by Admiral Oldendorf's battle line, which indeed delivered the coup de grace to the Japanese force. But among destroyer sailors, the story passed into legend. The tactic employed by the KIDD, the high-speed frontal assault to deliver torpedoes at minimal range, became known informally as doing a KIDD. It represented the ultimate expression of the destroyer ethos, audacity in the face of overwhelming odds. More significantly, the episode quietly influenced post-war naval doctrine. Studies conducted by the Naval War College in 1946 examined the effectiveness of aggressive destroyer tactics against capital ships, using the KIDD's action as a case study. The conclusion, marked confidential at the time, acknowledged that under specific circumstances, doctrine should be subordinate to battlefield initiative. When Alan Roby died in 1978 at the age of 60, his obituary in the local newspaper mentioned only his service as a Navy commander during World War II, his years as a mathematics teacher, and his devotion to family. No reference was made to Surigao Strait or the lives he had saved. But at his funeral, attended by family and a few local friends, 6 elderly men arrived unexpectedly. They had traveled from across the country, former crew members of the USS KIDD, who had served under Roby that October night in 1944. They stood at attention beside his grave as the honor guard folded the flag that had draped his casket. Chief Petty Officer Malcolm Reeves, by then in his 70s, spoke a few words to Roby's puzzled family. "Your husband, your father, never called himself a hero, but we who served with him knew better. There are thousands of men who came home from the Pacific because he had the courage to break the rules when breaking them was the only way to save lives." The USS KIDD herself survived the war and eventually became a museum ship in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Visitors today can walk her decks and view exhibits about her service, though the displays make only brief mention of the events at Surigao Strait. The full story remains largely untold in official histories. Perhaps the most fitting testament to Lieutenant Commander Roby's decision came in a letter written in 1992 by Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, who had initially reprimanded him for exceeding orders. The letter, discovered among Kinkaid's papers after his death, was addressed to the Naval Historical Center, but apparently never sent. In retrospect, Kinkaid wrote, "I have come to believe that Lieutenant Commander Roby's action with the USS KIDD at Surigao Strait exemplified the finest traditions of the naval service. In disregarding standing doctrine to meet an extraordinary threat, he demonstrated the kind of initiative that has characterized American naval officers at their best throughout our history. It is worth considering that strict adherence to doctrine would likely have resulted in far greater casualties among our forces. Some rules exist to be broken when circumstances demand it. The wisdom lies in knowing when those circumstances have arrived." The story of the USS KIDD charging Japanese battleships illuminates a truth often obscured in military history: the critical difference between doctrine and judgment. Naval doctrine in 1944 dictated that destroyers should never directly engage battleships. The doctrine was sound based on decades of naval experience and the mathematical realities of weapon ranges, armor thickness, and combat power. But doctrine cannot account for every circumstance. It cannot measure the moral weight of thousands of lives balanced against a calculated risk. It cannot quantify the advantage of surprise when doing the tactically unexpected. In choosing to charge directly at Japanese battleships that October night, Lieutenant Commander Alan Roby did not abandon naval doctrine recklessly. Rather, he recognized its limitations in an extraordinary situation, when the mathematical certainties of naval warfare, range, firepower, armor favored the enemy, he introduced an incalculable variable: audacity. The Japanese commanders aboard the Yamashiro and Fuso, operating according to their own doctrine, never expected an American destroyer to charge directly at their battle line. Their fire control systems were calibrated for long-range engagement or defense against torpedo attacks from the flanks, the standard doctrine of destroyer warfare. The frontal assault came literally from their tactical blind spot. This single decision, made in the darkness off the Philippine coast, saved an incalculable number of American lives. Had the Japanese battleships reached their intended firing positions unmolested, their 14-inch guns would have devastated the transport area. Thousands of American soldiers would have died before reaching the beaches of Leyte. Instead, one destroyer captain's willingness to break doctrine when circumstances demanded it disrupted the Japanese approach, drew other American forces into the engagement, and contributed significantly to the complete destruction of the Japanese Southern Force. As we reflect on this largely forgotten episode of World War II, we might ask ourselves, would we have broken the order or obeyed it? Would we recognize when rigid adherence to established doctrine becomes more dangerous than the calculated risk of defying it? Would we have the moral courage to act independently when lives hang in the balance? These questions transcend military history. They speak to fundamental choices we all face between safety and risk, between authority and individual judgment, between the security of established rules and the uncertainty of innovation. The story of the USS KIDD reminds us that sometimes the most difficult duty is knowing when duty itself requires us to break the rules. As the dawn light illuminated the aftermath of battle in Surigao Strait on October 25, 1944, the silhouette of a single Fletcher-class destroyer returning from the engagement carried a message that still resonates today. Courage is not measured merely by facing danger, but by making the hard choice when no perfect option exists. Remember the USS KIDD. Remember Lieutenant Commander Alan Roby and his crew who charged Japanese battleships when doctrine said it couldn't be done. Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means.